I'm Bill Squadron, President of Our Energy Policy. We're delighted to have you join us here today for a very important discussion on the critical issue of methane. We have, as you can see behind me, a superb panel of experts to discuss this issue. Thank you for taking time to join us today. For those of you who have colleagues and are working on this issue, we will also be posting the recording of the webinar on the Our Energy Policy website. We'll distribute summaries of what will undoubtedly be very insightful and important remarks from the panel. So there will be a great deal of additional opportunity to consider the discussion today. And in addition to that, I'd encourage all of you to look at the resource library on the OEP website, which is available to everyone and is the most comprehensive library online of energy materials, papers, reports, studies, and so forth, well curated and designed as part of our educational mission and informational programs to provide support to all of you who are working on these issues. So we're going to jump in. First, I do want to thank our partners, and particularly our co-host BP, for their support. It's a critical part of our ability to provide the programs here in New York, around the country, and online. OEP's mission is to bring people together in civil and substantive dialogue to really work on the tough issues of energy policy that we're all consumed with these days. And so we're very grateful to all of our partners, and thanks again to BP for co-hosting the event today. So we're particularly fortunate to have Tomas Carbonell kicking things off with opening remarks. As I'm sure many of you know, he is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Stationary Sources at EPA's Office of Air and Radiation, former Senior Counsel, Director of Regulatory Policy at Environmental Defense Fund, one of the nation's experts on the issues we're addressing today. And he will give some opening remarks and then has also kindly agreed to take one or two questions. So if you have questions, please note them, because he's willing to open the floor after his opening remarks. So Tomas, if you can kick things off. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, for that kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to kick off this event with just a few updates and remarks on EPA's work to address methane from the oil and gas sector. I think, as you all know, the Biden-Harris administration really sees reducing methane emissions as a critical priority, not just for achieving climate progress, but also for protecting public health, conserving energy resources, and delivering technology innovations. And I think that's manifest in a number of ways, and really became apparent in the first year of this administration, when the administration mobilized resources and expressed strong support for global action on methane in the form of spearheading the Global Methane Pledge, which aims to reduce methane emissions globally by 30% below 2020 levels by 2030. And in addition, revealed at the COP in November 2021, the U.S. Methane Emissions Reduction Action Plan, which highlighted commitments and actions that agencies across the government, including EPA, would be taking to address methane from multiple sectors, including oil and gas. And when you step back and sort of look at the problem of methane, particularly from the oil and gas sector, I think the reasons for that emphasis are quite clear, because when we look at the oil and gas sector, I think we see both a challenge and a really significant opportunity. And the challenge, obviously, is that this sector is the nation's leading industrial source of methane. Methane is a highly potent climate pollutant responsible for about a third of the global warming that we now see. And in addition to that, the methane that's emitted from the oil and gas sector is also accompanied by other health-harming pollutants like volatile organic compounds that contribute to ozone pollution across the country, as well as hazardous air pollutants like benzene. So these are all sort of important air impacts of the sector, associated with these emissions that are important to address. But we also see this huge opportunity because this, particularly over the last 20 years, this has been an industry where we've seen leading companies develop and deploy, innovative technologies to detect methane emissions and reduce them quickly. We've seen the development of other exciting best practices and technologies that are extraordinarily cost-effective and help not only reduce these air impacts, but significantly conserve valuable product in the form of natural gas. We've seen states, major oil and gas producing states, pioneer exciting programs to reduce these emissions as well. And over time, we've seen EPA develop regulatory efforts at the federal level to continue that progress and to take advantage of opportunities to reduce emissions in a cost-effective and workable way. So I want to just provide, in my limited time here, a few updates on 3 programs that EPA is now in the midst of implementing that I think really complement each other and are designed to try to build on this progress that we've seen over the years and really accelerate progress in reducing these harmful emissions while also delivering on the promise of technology innovation in this sector. And really securing all the economic benefits that come with addressing these emissions. The first of these programs is our regulatory effort under the Clean Air Act to both update and strengthen standards that are currently on the books for methane and VOCs from new and modified and reconstructed sources, as well as to put in place emission guidelines for states to follow in establishing standards to limit methane from existing oil and gas sources. And I'll speak to that further in just a minute. The second program is an important package of financial and technical assistance that we call the Methane Emission Reduction Program that was established by the IRA, signed into law by the president last year. And it's providing us sort of unprecedented resources to really support methane monitoring and mitigation efforts broadly in a number of different ways. And then the third is what we call the Waste Emissions Charge, another Inflation Reduction Act program that provides an important incentive for oil and gas companies to reduce emissions, particularly from high-emitting facilities. So just to speak to the regulatory program first, this has been a multi-year effort, but this did start in the first year of this administration. It's a rulemaking effort under the Clean Air Act, again, to address both new and existing sources of methane in the oil and gas sector. We started that effort in November of 2021 with a major proposal that was intended to comprehensively address some of the most significant sources of methane from this industry. And in response to that proposal, we received almost 500,000 comments and a lot of really high quality feedback from a wide variety of stakeholders. So we took all that feedback on board and just last fall issued a supplemental proposal that both expanded on what we initially laid out in our November 2021 proposal and also reflected a lot of improvements and refinements that reflected some of the input that we received. And the supplemental proposal, laid out really kind of a suite of standards that would apply to new sources, and then through the state planning process would be adopted for existing sources as well. And as I mentioned, the intent was to try to be comprehensive, but also to address, what really are sort of the biggest sources of methane, and for new sources, VOCs. And sources where we see, cost-effective kind of practical solutions as well as innovative technologies that can be deployed. Some of the standards that we included in the supplemental proposal include a fugitive emissions or leak detection monitoring program for well sites and for compressor stations. We included a very exciting advanced methane monitoring option that allows owners and operators of oil and gas facilities to deploy innovative technologies like aerial surveys and satellite surveys to detect emissions rapidly from their facilities as an alternative to kind of traditional ground-based monitoring surveys, and provided streamlined pathways for new technologies to be incorporated over time as part of that program. We proposed a program to address super emitting sources and to leverage data submitted by third parties for that purpose. And then we addressed other important individual pieces of equipment and sources in this sector, like pneumatic controllers, pumps, storage vessels, associated gas, as well as other sources. We estimated that this proposal would have enormous benefits. In 2030 alone, we estimated that our proposal would achieve an 87% reduction in the emissions from the sources that are actually covered by the proposal relative to 2005 levels, achieve hundreds of thousands of tons of reductions in hazardous air pollutants, as well as millions of tons of reductions in VOCs cumulatively through 2035, as well as conserve about $4.6 billion in natural gas that would otherwise go to waste. We got a large number of comments on this proposal as well, also about 500,000 comments. And I'm pleased to say today that we just submitted a final rule to the Office of Management and Budget for interagency review just yesterday. So we are now sort of entering the final process of getting a final rule out and ready to implement. And we're hoping to be finished with interagency review and have a rule finalized later this year. So that's the rulemaking effort. Just to say a little bit about the two other programs that I mentioned, both of them under the Inflation Reduction Act. The first relates to financial and technical assistance. And I think, here, what's important to recognize is that the IRA provided EPA with a total of about $1.55 billion in resources to support a variety of entities in methane reporting, monitoring, mitigation activities, including the cleanup of legacy pollution at oil and gas wells. And we have been working since that program was enacted to try to set up a process for efficiently distributing those resources and making sure that they achieve effectively the purposes that Congress had in mind in enacting this program. And we think they can really kind of work together with regulations and with the waste emissions charge to achieve prompt and cost-effective reductions in methane and other pollutants from oil and gas facilities. Our work on this program was really informed by a lot of stakeholder engagement, including requests for information, public hearings, broad meetings and consultations. And we've kind of taken that all on board as we've worked to implement the program. With respect to the financial resources, we decided in order to efficiently and best sort of leverage these resources to partner with the Department of Energy and the National Energy Technology Laboratory to actually administer the funding. This allows us to take advantage of extraordinary expertise at DOE when it comes to managing large-scale grant programs like this, as well as their own in-house expertise on methane, which is very complementary to ours. And we announced that partnership this past summer, and in August announced the availability of the initial tranche of this large pool of resources. In particular, we announced that we would be making up to $350 million available through a very efficient formula grant funding process that would go directly to states for them to use in further administering funds to help monitor and reduce methane emissions and support environmental restoration of well sites. This particular tranche of funding is really focused on marginal conventional wells and supporting well plugging, as well as other activities related to environmental restoration and monitoring at those wells. We're currently in a process where we're waiting for applications from states for this funding to come in. I think there's like a mid-October deadline for submitting those applications, and we are hoping to very quickly move to administer that, actually award that funding soon after those applications come in. This is just the first in a series of funding opportunities. We are planning to announce comprehensive or competitive grant funding opportunities using other parts of this pool of resources soon. I also want to just touch on the waste emissions charge. As I mentioned, the IRA directs EPA to implement a new program that is intended to incentivize additional emission reductions and almost kind of build a bridge to the implementation of our Section 111 Clean Air Act standards for new and existing sources by establishing a waste emissions charge that's focused on high-emitting large oil and gas facilities. These are facilities that report to our greenhouse gas reporting program that exceed an annual emissions threshold that's specified in the IRA, and that also emit above methane intensity thresholds that are set out in the IRA and that vary depending on the segment that these facilities are located in. to facilitate the implementation of this waste emissions charge, we're taking essentially two steps. The first is that we are, pursuant to a specific directive in the IRA, undertaking a rulemaking to update and improve our greenhouse gas reporting program regulations for oil and gas sources. We call this the Subpart W regulations. And we issued a proposal earlier this year on August 1st. We are taking public comment on that, I think, through Monday. And in that proposal, we're proposing a number of changes to our regulations that we think will both allow us to collect more information on emissions that we haven't had before, including information on large release events that haven't traditionally been part of the reporting program, as well as really kind of bringing up to date the techniques that are used for methane monitoring and reporting to make sure that as the waste emissions charge is administered, we have the best possible understanding and basis for the emissions that are the basis of that charge. We are, looking forward to getting the comments on that proposal, and we're hoping to finalize it in the spring of next year. The second implementation step that we're taking is to undertake a rulemaking that would actually create the administrative architecture for the waste emissions charge and address, both the calculation of the charge and some interpretive questions that arise naturally because of various exemptions that are built into the statute. And we are working to develop a proposed rule and put that into an interagency review, hoping to get that out later this year and finalize next year. I think stepping back broadly, the waste emissions charge, the way it's written, really explicitly dovetails with our regulations. It's also meant to complement the resources that Congress provided for methane monitoring and mitigation in the IRA. And we see it as an important way to incentivize additional and earlier reductions from this sector. So those are like updates on EPA's efforts on methane mitigation. I hope that was helpful. As I mentioned earlier, this is really part of a broader administration effort, and it's been important for us as we've gone through the process of implementing these programs to work with other federal agencies that are active in this space, like the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration and the Bureau of Land Management, to make sure we're all well coordinated and working in a complementary fashion. And again, reflect that kind of whole of government commitment to this issue. So with that, I'll stop and would welcome one or two questions.
Thanks, really appreciate that. And I think you said 500,000 comments on the rulemaking.
So we did that twice. We got 500,000 comments on the first proposal, and then another 500,000 on the second.
I thought that only Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift could ride.
a lot of engagement.
In any event, we do have time for a question.
Yeah.
Jeff Deloy, Bloomberg News. I have to ask you a question about the topic du jour, but have something more substantive. I'm wondering how a lapse in funding would affect your work on all of these initiatives, but especially the methane emission reduction fee and program. And then also, in all those comments you received, you heard an earful, of course, about the ability to go further to minimize flaring. What do you see as the opportunity in the final rule to push that just a little bit further, if not all the way?
Yeah. So on the first question regarding the shutdown, I'm actually not the best person to speak for EPA on plans for a shutdown. Obviously, we're hoping that a shutdown can be avoided. We're also taking, we're planning to take all appropriate steps in the event of a lapse in funding. But I really can't speak to the details of that or how that might affect EPA's work. In terms of associated gas flaring, I can't speak to the content of the final rule, because it's just entered interagency review. I will just note that, as part of the supplemental proposal, we proposed measures that would apply to both new and existing wells that were intended to reflect really kind of the broad range of opportunities in the form of different technologies and practices that are available to oil and gas operators to minimize or avoid flaring and to encourage companies to utilize those where possible. And we got a lot of feedback on those elements, including feedback indicating where there might be implementation issues, as well as further opportunities to address that source. And we've tried to take that on board as we develop the final rule.
Question? Yep.
Hi, nice to be here. To go off of that a little bit, also on the here. I know you can't talk about the content of the final rule, but any other sort of buckets of comments or topics that you want to, that you thought about in building the final rules that you want to identify and flag as?
It sort of feels like you're asking me to pick my favorite children. No, I'll just note, I mean, I know this may sound trite, but I mean, with all the comments that we received, both through the initial proposal and the supplemental proposal, I mean, there was almost no aspect of this program that did not receive significant attention from commenters. And I think one of the benefits of having gone through two different proposals is that we were able to do a bit of iteration with almost like a dialogue with the broad community of commenters. And that's really helped us, as we've gone through this rulemaking process to try to identify the sort of best options for having an ambitious set of standards that are also workable and cost effective.
Hi, Chris Knight with Argus Media. So with the waste emission charge rule, there was some concern from industry groups at the start about this mismatch between 0.2% being exempt and basically the weight versus the volume, because gas is sold by volume and the law refers to weight. Is that a surmountable challenge for you guys to be able to figure out a way to structure it where you can still charge a fee even though there might be this mismatch?
Yeah, I think just given where we're at in the development of a proposal, I don't think I can really speak to that kind of detailed implementation issue here.
Any other questions? I know we let Moscow, let's have a hand, please.
Thank you all again.
So thanks. Now we're going to ask our panel to join us on the podium, and I'm going to turn it over to Kyle Danish as our moderator. Kyle, many of you know as one of the nation's experts on energy projects, markets, financing, law, a partner at Ness Feldman, also a senior associate for energy and national security programs at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So we are delighted to have him moderate this panel, and he'll introduce you to our panelists. Kyle?
Thank you, Bill. And thank you all for staying on for this portion of the program. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. We had an excellent panel to cover the topic that we have today. Sitting to my immediate left is Carrie Jenks from Harvard Law School, where she is the executive director of the Environmental and Energy Law program. And Carrie has done a remarkable job over the years in convening stakeholder groups and pressing forward on various issues under energy and climate policy. To Carrie's left is Jon Goldstein. He's the Senior Director for Regulatory and Legislative Affairs for the Environmental Defense Fund. Based in Colorado, he leads EDF's efforts to improve regulation of the oil and gas industry, protect air and water resources. Jon's Mogstad, who is federal policy and government affairs, construction and operations, climate, and ESG. Isabel develops and advocates policy and regulations that advance BP's ambition by 2030. So we got to hear initially hear from Tomas from EPA. I feel like it should be said that there, and you mentioned this, federal methane policy is actually sprawling over a number of agencies and efforts right now. Methane policy being built for the first time at the pipeline and activists at the Bureau of Land Management and Flaring. The Department of Energy is developing a set of policies and programs around best practices of methane monitoring and intelligence. At the State Department and with DOE and EPA and others, there's a whole effort to interact with the European Union as it develops its first time methane. And then against this backdrop of federal activity, and I should say important activity at the state level in particular, John, in Colorado, one of the states where we're at the same time, you have this very robust activity occurring voluntarily and on a private basis in the private sector, in the oil and gas industry, where companies are pioneering a number of new methods and technologies, methane detection, monitoring, measurement, and mitigation. Given rise to an industry that is certifying and verifying these efforts. That are now products that are labeled responsibly sourced gas or differentiated gas. So there's quite a bit of activity in this area. Unquestionably, though, EPA is sort of at the tip of the spear. And as Tomas mentioned, a very important regulatory initiatives underway. I was going to lead off talking about the first one, which Tomas talked about, which is the development of Clean Air Act regulations, gas sector, NSPS, Quado E and P, Quado C rules, if you're following the terminology at home. And what's good about our panelists is they are not nearly as constrained as Tomas was to talk about what they expect to see, hope to see in the final rule. So I'm going to take full advantage of that liberty and ask, starting with Carrie, what are you looking for in the final rule that we now know is sitting over OMB methane regulation for the oil and gas sector?
I think you probably should.
Okay. So as Kyle mentioned, at the program that we work at Harvard Law's EELP, we try to convene diverse stakeholders. And so we've been working for the past few years on the methane Quado rules to think about how do the environmental groups, how do the oil and gas industry, how do the technology providers think about these requirements? Because what's interesting in this rulemaking is the technology is advancing faster than any administration can keep up with. Regulations are designed to be deliberate and thoughtful, and you've seen EPA's taken comment 2 times. The technologies keep outpacing what an agency can do. So the question we've been thinking about is, can the agency design a rule that allows that technology advancement to keep happening? So you don't design a regulation for what we know today, but where is the industry going, and how can there be criteria by which the technologies can continue to improve over time, so you don't have to go back and ask EPA to keep refining the rule as technologies advance. So I'll be looking to see, what are those criteria, and do they create the incentives to allow technologies to keep going? And then I think the super emitter program that Tomas mentioned is another way, to the extent we're getting more data, and companies are seeing more data, environmental groups are seeing more data. How can that data be used and create incentives for companies to find those leaks faster and fix them on their own timing?
Thank you, Carrie. John, what are you looking for in the final rule?
Thanks, Kyle. I'm going to treat this sort of like an improv class and say yes and. And so in addition to the great points that Carrie made, and those are definitely things that EDF is keeping an eye on as well, because they're very important. We'll also be taking a close and careful look at sort of the equipment standards, the tried and true approaches that leading states and other jurisdictions have taken in the past to reduce emissions. Things like the very strong proposed standards for swapping out pneumatic controllers and going to zero bleed devices. It's the second largest source of methane emissions from the oil and gas production sector. So it's a really vital way to get reductions quickly. Leading producers are already doing this. EQT, who's the biggest natural gas producer in the country, has already done a program to swap out all of their polluting pneumatics. So this can be done. And so we're very excited about that and hope to see that make its way through to the final. We were very happy to see the improvements that were made to the leak detection and repair program in the supplemental, and the fact that, in that supplemental proposal, all wells, even the smaller, sometimes called marginal wells, get regular inspections for leaks. There's a false assumption out there that a marginal well, a lower producing well, may not be as big of a source of emissions. And what the science has shown when folks have gone out is that that's not true. These wells only account for about 6% of the production in the US, but they account for half of the production site emissions. So it's really important that these things get checked for leaks on a regular basis. And then third, and Jen's question alluded to this, we'll be looking at the flaring provisions and seeing, what can be done there. Leading states have really, curtailed this practice in a major way. Colorado and New Mexico have essentially ended pollution and waste from routine flaring. So I think there's a great opportunity there, especially given, the energy security benefits as well. And we can talk about that later.
Isabel, what are you looking for in the final rule?
Sure. Thanks, Kyle. So it's good to see everyone. And there's going to be a lot of overlap, I think, in some of the things that we're looking for, but maybe I'll address them from a slightly different perspective, thinking about this more from business implementation and investment. I guess before I start, I think it's worth just acknowledging sort of why BP cares so much about this rule. I think it's pretty much impossible to overstate how important the U.S. is to BP. 50% of our CapEx came to the U.S. last year. 50% of our people are in the U.S. I think over 50% of our investors are American. So, just the importance of the U.S. and its regulatory frameworks is key for our business. And we have been unequivocal in our support for the direct federal regulation of methane. We think it's the right thing to do for our business. We think it's the right thing to do, of course, for the environment, and it's important for both domestic and international energy security. When we're looking at the final rule, I would just think it's important to acknowledge, this has been a deeply collaborative process. I think in some ways it's been a model for collaboration. We've had the opportunity not just to engage through the comment process, but to substantively engage with both career staff and appointees, not just to raise our issues, but also come with constructive solutions to ways we can strengthen the rule and actually achieve the EPA's goals of a well-designed, efficient, effective rule that's also workable for industry. And that doesn't mean that it won't require change by companies and it won't require investment, but that is the right thing to do. And we think it makes both commercial sense and also there are real market incentives to do so. A couple of things that we're going to be looking for, some of them have been touched on already. So the first is a robust pathway for continuous monitoring technologies. I think it's just worth acknowledging that when I started working on this issue, which was about 8 years ago at Environmental Defense Fund, Jon might remember, there were folks who were building continuous monitors in their garages, literally. And, it's kind of remarkable how far we've come in less than a decade. And I think the EPA's rule exemplifies that. There's now a pathway for continuous monitors to be used to detect and measure methane emissions. And while that's a significant step forward, we also think that there are some key changes that we're hoping to see in the final. An example of that is the removal of a condition that continuous monitoring technology is commercially available. We don't think commercial availability is a proxy for technology effectiveness, and it's not required under the Clean Air Act. And so there's some fairly tactical changes that we think will help unlock innovation in that space and are important for sort of the continued deployment and advancement of those technologies. We've touched on routine flaring. I think it's important to note that BP strongly supports the EPA addressing routine flaring in the final rule, eliminating it and minimizing additional flaring where possible. We think not only is it the right thing to do, but it's necessary. BP does not routinely flare. We won't bring a well online unless we have sufficient gas takeaway capacity. And we also are installing a range of technologies to make sure that when we do have to flare, we do so efficiently. And if there are any problems, we're remotely and automatically notified. So we think it can be done, and we think it needs to be done. And then I'll just quickly mention also the super emitter response program, which Carrie touched on as well. We fully support the EPA finalizing this type of third-party monitoring program. from a company perspective, if there's data out there that suggests that we have a significant leak event at one of our facilities, we want to know about it. We do think that the final version of the super emitter response program does need to be modified to make it legally durable. We're hoping to see sort of a much more meaningful and significant role for the EPA to play in the oversight of the program. And that's not a trivial task to hopefully sort of make sure the EPA plays a key role in validating and authenticating data coming through that program. So we'll be looking for changes, including things like a more reasonable timeline for the publication of that data rather than having it come out in real time, making clear distinctions between when emissions are fugitive emissions versus when perhaps they're operations and maintenance activities, sort of known activity. And then finally, I would just add, we'll be looking for how do you really incentivize operator participation and deep engagement in the program through the use of sort of appropriate and proportionate safe harbors that incentivize more data and information sharing that aids the EPA, aids other affected and interested stakeholders, and benefits the companies as well.
Thank you to each of you. I want to go back for a moment. Isabel raised the super emitter response program. That is one of the more innovative parts of what EPA had in the supplemental proposal, and I'm confident that some version of it will be in the final rule. I wanted to go back for a moment. Carrie, could I put you on the spot to just explain the super emitter response program, and then we could address some of the issues that Isabel raised?
Yeah, I'll explain it from what EPA proposed, not knowing where they finalize it based on some of the feedback that Isabel was raising. So the idea of the proposal is that there's satellite information or for large emission events, it doesn't have to just be satellite information, but 100 kilograms per hour. So something large happens, third parties see that data coming in. And the question is, can EPA use that data, provide the companies that information, and then have an obligation of the companies to then go out and figure out what happened and fix that leak. So to date, there hasn't been a regulatory obligation to respond to that third-party data. I think, NGOs can put out information at any point, so there's not a difference in that. It can be public information. I think the challenge for EPA is how do you use that information and try to create the incentives for people to act on that information. So that, I think, is what is going to be critical to see in the final rule. How do they balance those opportunities out? I think, to Isabel's point, it's just complicated sometimes. You'll get a satellite information, you'll see that the plume happened. You could have a compression station over a pipeline, and those could be two different companies. And so how do you quickly figure out who owns it, who's responsible? Because it's intermittent. It's not happening for days upon days. It could have just happened for an hour on one day, and then an hour or 2 weeks later, someone goes out in good faith and looks for it. They don't see anything. So in order to respond to that emissions event, you do need to have some good processes so that people can act on that information as well.
Jon, can I ask you to sort of address EDS views on the super emitter response program?
I'll just briefly sort of add to what Carrie was saying, which I think was a really good synopsis, and point out that this is sort of the way things are moving in a lot of ways. More and more data is becoming available about what's going on. There are satellites up there now that are producing data. There are companies that are flying these basins. EDF has been flying basins with our methane air project. And soon we'll have our own satellite up in space early next year. That'll be providing data too. And it's all really exciting. But information is only good if it drives action and leads to, fewer emissions and efforts to do that. And so I think the super emitter response program is potentially an important way to do that. It's innovative. I think it recognizes, the way that this technology is coming to market quickly and can be leveraged to, get reductions in the field.
Right. So this is partially a story of how much technology is advancing in this area, but this is definitely a little bit of an unusual mechanism within a regulatory program. Not unheard of. There's fence line monitoring and other provisions. But maybe if I could circle back again, Isabel, to some of your points about the perspective of an operator that may be getting this sort of notice. where, as Carrie was saying, there are in many cases many overlapping operations in a field, and this becomes now a certain sort of actionable information. So, what are some of the concerns, and what are some of the hopes that that BP has for how this program would actually operate?
Sure. So I can offer a few reflections. I'll couch this in the frame of, one of the things we've spent time thinking about as a company, with our peers in industry, with external colleagues, and with the EPA. Sort of, what does this look like in practice? How will this work? And one of the reasons we already have some of that perspective is because we engaged in the EDF Permian Map project. And so I think we already have learnings from existing third-party efforts of how this can go, and have also then sort of forecasted how it might not go too, which I think is important. So a couple thoughts from where we sit. One is, how do you ensure that the SERP program notifies the right person within the right company at the right time? There needs to be sort of a formal mechanism by which, if a third party, an approved third party, detects emissions, they know who to reach out to at the company. It wouldn't be helpful to us. It would also be extremely inefficient, frankly, if they're calling me sitting in Washington, D.C., versus, the right person out in the field who can get after it. So there are a number of practicalities like that, which seem simple, but actually are going to require thought and time, and making sure we have that ready to go from the beginning. I think Carrie mentioned intermittency, and that's a real concern and challenge as it relates to, how do you know if a third party detected emissions at your facility, when that started and when that ended? I mentioned continuous monitoring before. I think that's a really important use case for that technology. If you have sensors deployed at your facilities that, when running, when they're in the right operational context, are effectively running all day in all conditions. If you can timestamp when something started and when something ended, and be able to credibly document that to the EPA, then what does that mean for the required follow-up? Right? I believe the SERP, and Carrie, keep me honest here, I believe the SERP requires, initial root cause investigation within 5 days. I think you have another 30 days to undertake whatever mitigation measures you need to. But what if you have the data and documentation to show that something happened in a brief period and it's gone? How do you think about managing for intermittency? And then I already touched on operations and maintenance, but I think it's important to bring up again, there are emissions events that continue in the field, particularly at facilities where we haven't fully electrified our equipment yet, that are known operations or known maintenance activity. And if you have that operational context and information and have a pathway to share that with the EPA, how does that impact when you do and don't take further investigative or corrective actions? So I think all of these are solvable. Nothing that I'm saying is a showstopper, but I think it does just reflect that, we need to think about how this actually will play out and make sure that we address these so that operators are incentivized to quickly respond to the program and not feel like it's either an operational safety hindrance, but actually benefiting the bottom line, benefiting the company, benefiting the environment.
I want to circle back to flaring. There's unquestionably a global movement to try to crack down on flaring. And there's something, sort of viscerally offensive about the idea of just flaring gas into the air. At the same time, I guess I've come to understand that in certain parts of the country, and this may be less the case in Colorado than in other places, you have a well and you're producing gas ahead of the infrastructure to take the gas someplace. And so there's at least some limited time where traditionally there's a certain amount of flaring. What constitutes routine flaring and sort of attacking routine flaring, I guess, is sort of a definitional issue. But Jon, can I ask you to speak to that?
Happy to, Kyle. You're right that, it's not the problem in Colorado that it is in other places. That's not true with New Mexico, though. And New Mexico has acted. So, New Mexico's got a significant portion of the Permian Basin, the most active drilling area in the world. And, they have acted. So I think it shows it's possible. And you're absolutely right to say that there's flaring and there's flaring. There are upsets, there are emergency situations, there are finite periods of time during the completion of a new well when absolutely you want to send that to a flare and not just vent it. That's not what you want to happen. What routine flaring is what's happening right now in the Texas Permian and the Bakken in particular up in North Dakota, where night after night, day after day, month after month, these are wells that are producing associated gas that's just being burned off. And there is not an effort in place currently under those states' regulatory actions that's going to drive any kind of effort to get those plugged into the gas gathering system. They just continue to approve flaring permits and allow that to continue. And it's a problem from a pollution perspective. The flares produce pollution, particulates, and CO2. They also, what folks that are going out in the field and measuring are finding is they are not operating as advertised. And they're allowing far too much methane to slip through. They're a much larger source of methane emissions than the 98% or 96% control that folks think that they provide. They're a problem for folks that live in close proximity to these wells. And frankly, I think you kind of were making reference to this about sort of the unconscionableness of flaring. I mean, let's think about what's going on in Ukraine and the fact that the Russian natural gas is another weapon for Russia in that effort. So the fact that we're burning off this gas at the rate that we're doing it right now in Texas and North Dakota, unconscionable is a good word.
Keep it in the pipe movement. Okay. And I'm now venturing away from our question side district because you guys are talking about so many interesting things. So everyone's being put on the spot from here on out. Carrie, I'll put you on the spot first. Tomas described, there are these essentially 3 EPA policy-making efforts on methane. There's the Clean Air Act regulation, which we've just been talking about. There's the methane emission reduction program, which is the technical and financial assistance that came out of the Inflation Reduction Act. And then there's very prominently the waste methane emissions charge, also sometimes called the methane fee, that came out of the Inflation Reduction Act, which has a sort of a complicated overlap with the EPA regulation. Under some circumstances, full implementation of the EPA regulation will get you exempted from the methane fee. There's certainly a lot to talk about there. I guess I'm also curious to have you talk about, it strikes me that as a mode of policy and regulation, the Clean Air Act regulation and the methane charge work very differently. When I think of the EPA regulations that we're going to see pretty soon, I think of them as generally doing 2 broad things. One is a leak detection and repair program for known areas of oil and gas facilities that have, fugitive methane. And that's very much about detect, find something, and repair it. Find a leak and repair it. And then there's the sort of equipment changeover that Jon was highlighting, all the different like pneumatic controllers, pneumatic pumps, et cetera. So it's sort of leak detection and repair, equipment replacement. The methane fee is structured differently. It's really about, we're going to measure your methane intensity of your whole facility. Methane intensity being, we're going to get some measure of the amount of gas going through your facility and the emissions that you have from your facility. And we're going to make you reduce that percentage. You should have a very small amount of methane emissions to your facility. But it's essentially a measurement, a quantification across the whole facility of your methane emissions, which is a little bit different than detect, leak, repair it, replace equipment. It's sort of more of a performance type of approach. And I just wondered to see if you would talk a little bit about what you think that may mean for policy and what we might expect EPA to do when it gets around to rule number 3, which is how they're going to create this architecture.
Yeah, I guess I'd answer it two ways. One, I think EPA has to look at what's its statutory authority for each of those three rules, and they have to fit within that box for each rule. But when you think about it from an environmental perspective or from an industry perspective, that box doesn't matter. The question is, can those boxes work together to pull advanced technologies in a consistent manner so that there's an incentive to better find those leaks and fix them so that the environment benefits from reducing those emissions. It's hard, though, to get all of those incentives right when EPA is having to work within those boxes. Historically, the subpart W, the inventory rule, has been just to intend to create a consistent inventory across the sector. And now it is being used because of the IRA to actually be the basis for the fee. And you want everyone to look more and find leaks, which means you're going to find more things. So as you find things more, you're going to pay more of a fee. And that's a weird incentive. You actually want to encourage people to pay less of a fee. So EPA gets this, and I think they're trying to think it through, but I think it's going to be important for stakeholders to think about that interaction and help EPA come up with solutions that align those incentives, at least avoid creating unintended disincentives. I don't know. That's helpful.
Yeah, I invite the rest of you to speak to that as well.
I think that one of the interesting things that I think about the interplay between, the Quad-O regulations, the fee, et cetera, is how they sort of highlight, a movement towards more data and more transparency around an industry that, we haven't had a lot of that in the past. So an oil and gas site is not like a coal-fired power plant, where if you want to know what the emissions from a coal-fired power plant are, you put a system at the top of the smokestack. It's pretty simple, and you know exactly what's coming out. An oil and gas site has thousands of sources of emissions, potential sources, and there are hundreds of thousands of these sites across the country. So how do we know, and how do we assess that fee? That's why it's so important that we get the science right of how we're going out and we're measuring. EPA is wrestling with this. The state of Colorado, as you mentioned, is wrestling with it as well. They established reduction targets through their legislature overall for the economy and then specifically for the oil and gas sector. And now they're in the process of figuring out, well, how do we track against that? How do we ensure that this is where we are today, and this is where we are in 2030, and this is where we are in 2050. And getting that science right to be able to measure it is critical to doing that. The current inventories, are thought to underestimate by 60%. So that's a lot of emissions you're leaving on the table if these programs aren't fixed to be more empirical and to be based, not on outdated modeling assumptions, but on actual data that's being collected in the field.
Isabel, did you want to speak to the methane fee interaction?
Sure. I think I'll acknowledge that, we share a goal with the EPA of having not only more, but better data about what's actually happening out in the field and sort of the real numbers and values that underpin our reporting. We have an aim to install methane measurement technology at all of our major oil and gas processing sites by the end of this year. And you can imagine that's going to include sort of a suite of different technologies, including but not limited to continuous monitoring, which we've talked quite a bit about already. And Carrie and I were speaking about this before we came on the panel. When you think about what the greenhouse gas reporting program and that inventory was originally designed to do and is intended to do is to allow for this sort of apples to apples comparison of operator data to get this sort of singular and fulsome picture of what's occurring in the US. And that's important. And of course that needs to continue. And both for the purposes of the methane fee and also individual company reporting for a company like ours that is moving more towards measurement over time, there also needs to be this clear and defined pathway for how you actually incentivize operators to use more and better data that we are starting to acquire with other technologies. And I think, one of the things we've identified in the Subpart W proposal that gives us pause, and we think there's an opportunity to work on as they continue with that rulemaking is, most of these advanced technologies are lumped together into this one top-down approach category. And the way that the EPA describes all of these advanced technologies in the proposal really characterizes them as looking at methane from large spatial scales over fairly short durations. It indicates that the technologies are largely only deployed during daylight hours. And I think indeed that's applicable for aerial surveillance, probably for drone surveillance. I would look to Jon if it's the same for satellites. But the way that the technology set is described, it lumps all of them together, and it doesn't actually acknowledge that, in fact, continuous monitoring really doesn't fit in to that sort of top-down model that's envisaged by the EPA. And I would offer that, these technologies that now are, close to or at individual pieces of equipment that when functioning properly are running all day in most ambient conditions at all times, day and night, can indeed get you to information that is comparable, if not greater, to the methods that are being proposed for sort of the standard capturing of most data, most equipment sources. And so, I think in the spirit of trying to get towards more quantification and moving away from emissions factors, but also creating the right incentives for operators to invest in those solutions, we're going to need to see sort of more harmonization and probably some distinction between the types of technologies, their capabilities, and then a more robust use case for them.
Yeah, go ahead, Carrie.
I was going to add also, I think it's important to think through the timing of each rule. So EPA had to come out with their Subpart W proposal before they finalized the Quad O rules. So I think it's going to be also important to think through how can EPA now, when they finalize Subpart W and propose a methane fee, they can look back to whatever they finalize on Quad O too. So there's also this catch up that EPA is going to have to figure out too.
I'm going to do one more question here, I think, before we go to the audience. I'm going to go back to you, Isabel. So on my sort of framing construct here, it seems to me if the Quad O rules are sort of leak detection, repair, and equipment, and then the methane fee is emissions intensity of my facility, then you have this other thing going on there, which is outside the government, which is about sort of voluntary activity in the oil and gas sector, which is differentiated gas, which is responsibly sourced gas, which I think in some ways is sort of almost like a chain, a supply chain sort of lens, right? Because you're saying essentially you buyer who might be in the European Union or might be a power company that wants to have green gas, I can say something about the whole chain that got my gas to you that can deliver a message about additional effort to detect, eliminate, mitigate methane. Help us on, I mean, you don't have to take my particular description of it, but how would you describe how this sort of sector is fitting into this activity, and what does it mean for BP?
Well, Kyle, since you're going a little off script, I'm going to go a little off script.
Yeah, none of us are as constrained as Tomas.
Yeah.
You can do
So I'll answer your question, but I think I'll also, if it's okay, also just talk a little bit about methane policy with a slightly broader lens, because I think that's exciting and it's also really important. So I think what you just pointed out is, we now have a more diverse toolkit of policy solutions to get after the methane problem in the oil and gas sector, right? We've talked a lot about the Quad O performance standards and having that sort of clear, strong regulatory framework that sort of underpins and creates sort of baseline methane performance across our industry. Critical piece of the toolkit. We also think the federal government has a very important role to play in the voluntary space. You touched briefly on differentiated or certified natural gas, BPX, which is our U.S. onshore business, has certified our whole U.S. portfolio through these voluntary efforts. We think those market-based programs are important, and the government is going to likely have a role to play in making sure those programs are standardized, there's transparency and integrity, because sort of the long-term durability of that space, we think, is going to, in part, be contingent on sort of the market trusting those products. And then we've talked a lot about the methane fee, but I do think it's worth just pointing out, that's not only is that our first market-based policy mechanism in this space, it's also our first federal price on carbon, right? It happens to be CH4, not CO2. And so there's a role for the federal government, not only in implementing the methane fee, but we would also like to see an economy-wide price on carbon. So it's not just limited to those CH4 molecules. Where I'm going to go off script, if I may, just for a quick second, is, when it comes to the atmosphere and it comes to climate warming, the atmosphere doesn't distinguish or discriminate where methane comes from, right? Methane is methane. And so the federal government also has an important role to play in other methane policies that can drive down what we're putting into the atmosphere. And a great example of that, since we're really talking largely about the EPA today, is the Renewable Fuel Standard and eRINs. We also have methane going to atmosphere coming off of landfills and landfill waste. But the EPA has a program. It didn't get finalized in the last Renewable Fuel Standard set rule, but we hope it will in the next one, which will incentivize capturing methane coming off of sources like landfills, converting it to electricity, and then selling that electricity to help decarbonize transportation and power EVs. And that's another huge opportunity, right? And so I just put that out there because I know we're here largely talking about oil and gas methane, and that's critically important. But we also have other sources that we need to get after and other policies that are effective and available to us to do so. So that's another huge space where we need to see the EPA continue to lead and hopefully put that into the next RFS set rule next year.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Isabel. I mean, it seems like what a day it is for renewable natural gas. I mean, I think there are so many uses of it in transportation and hydrogen. I think I would want to be an owner of renewable natural gas. With that, I want to thank the panelists for participating in the discussion. I think we'd like to now turn it out to the questions from the audience here. And please make yourself known and we'll direct your question.
Questions? Here we go. Go ahead, Jess.
Hi, Ben Cato from CSS. Wondering if you could comment on the greenhouse gas reporting in subpart that. If I understand correctly, the IRA methane fee basically said you have to find ways to empirical measurement. Having that a little bit. Probably, what's your reaction to the fee?
Like you first. Go ahead, John.
Sure. I'll go, and then I think these guys will have probably thoughts to share too. I think it definitely moves the ball forward. We'll be filing our comments on Monday, and I know there's a lot of folks back in the home office right now working feverishly on those. I feel like the common denominator to what Isabel was just talking about is trust. And, whether we're talking about differentiated gas, whether we're talking about updating, subpart W or what have you, it's getting these details right so that we can believe what's being reported is accurate. And, we're definitely going to be having some targeted areas where we're going to suggest ways EPA could improve the proposal for subpart W. But overall, I think, it's moving the ball in the right direction.
I don't have much more to say beyond what Jon just shared. I mean, I think, we think it's important, not just because we have to, have IRA implementation for the methane fee, but just in principle, moving away from emissions factors and moving towards more measurement-based and quantification-based data is really important. The devil's in the details, and how you do that matters. The EPA has proposed, I think, a good first step, and there's substance that needs to be worked out over time. We've talked about continuous monitoring and teasing that out from these top-down approaches and the advanced technology, so they're not just all lumped together. there's an opportunity as well as it relates to the new large emissions event category. How do you use better data coming from advanced technologies to time-bound large emissions events, right? There are details in the rule that make assumptions about how long those events are lasting. And, if we have the information and the technology to say, this is when it started and this is when it ended, and from a trust perspective, let us show you that, there are incentives to be had, not only to increase the fidelity of the information, but also I think create a more accurate and honest two-way conversation between reporters and the EPA. And then I think, just the final thing in principle is, going back to this notion, what was the GHGRP intended for? How is it now going to be used in the context of the methane fee? And considerations the EPA needs to keep in mind throughout this process, knowing that it's going to be used in a new and different way. And I know that's sort of a big overarching statement, but I do think it's going to be a theme that we'll be wanting to have conversation with the EPA on, because now it's not just about the inventory. There are knock-on effects for the methane fee as well.
I'll say for myself, something that surprised me in the Subpart W proposal, which remember is the sort of architecture for the methane fee. What gets reported in Subpart W forms the basis of the calculation of your methane fee, is that, just going back, recall that Tomas really was proud to report in the regulatory program the way that the EPA had proposed a whole framework for approving advanced measurement technologies for use in detecting methane for the regulatory program. But in this Subpart W proposal, there's this sort of complete absence of a similar framework to onboard and approve these measurement technologies for the Subpart W reporting. And this seems, surprising in many respects. And part of it is what Isabel talked about. They had a strange way of lumping together all of these advanced technologies under the rubric of aerial or satellite, which admittedly are just sort of periodic looks. They're not a way really to measure your emissions. But continuous monitors are developing rapidly to do precisely that, to really measure the emissions at a site. And there seemed to be no onboarding framework for that outlined in the Subpart W proposal. Rather, there seems to be just this limited use for sort of time bounding the large events, again, which is just a detection thing. So that feels like a big miss to me, and I'm hoping that EPA will rectify that between now and the final rule, or maybe address it when they do this third rule, right, which is the actual architecture of the methane fee implementation. Because otherwise, I think you're going to be stuck with a system for the methane fee that just relies mostly on emission factors. And, those are certainly improved and they're more conservative and et cetera, but they're hardly empirical in the sense, Ben, in your question, nor providing a real measurement of one's emissions, which seems like rather important if you're going to be applying essentially a per ton tax. I think you want to get like a pretty accurate measurement of a facility's emissions rather than rely on these sort of broad-based estimates. So that's what I sort of was surprised about in that proposal.
I would agree. I think EPA for Subpart W is thinking component by component, because that's how they've done it. So what's the emissions on this component, and then you add it up. And the top-down measurements, take away the continuous, put the continuous aside, are a site-wide piece or an estimate. And so they're thinking we're going to stay component by component because that's how we've done it. It allows, as Isabel said, sort of the apples to apples comparison. But I think it's also important to remember EPA, this is hard because the technologies keep advancing so fast. And so it's a proposal, and that's why people are submitting comments on Monday. And I think stakeholders need to bring solutions to the table to say, we think this is the criteria by which you should judge a continuous emission monitor. This is how it could be used. And then it needs to be transparent, because in the end, you've got to trust the data so you can compare component by component and company by company and actually feel confident about the emissions. Because that, as Jon was saying, that's what's been hard to date, is we actually don't know what are the emissions. So if we're going to change it, we need to feel good that we're going in the right direction. But I think it's possible, but I think stakeholders really need to help EPA do that, do it well.
Other questions?
I think we had a question in the back right.
Yeah. Scott Baker. In July, the White House held its first.
I can't speak to the planning of the summit and who was there in the room and who wasn't. I am aware that the methane mitigation industry was there. As far as, the folks that are creating these technologies, I think there was like a tech fair that was a part of the summit where they were presented. As far as what happens next, my understanding is that, one of the things that happened there was the creation of this all of government task force where, we've talked a lot today about just even, wrapping your head around the different efforts at EPA is complicated. And then you add BLM, and then you add PHMSA, and then you add DOE. It gets really complicated really fast. And so how do we ensure that these efforts are aligned and not stepping on each other's toes in unintentional ways? I think that's the where this task force comes in to try and, align those things.
Time to turn over to you, Jordan.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any more last questions? Michael in the front.
So I just want to clarify, when you say customer, are you meaning like literally the consumer of gas? Okay. Or off taker, yeah. Panelists? I mean, I think Isabel, you will be.
I'll speak broadly. I think the investor pressure and the customer pressure continues to push companies to continue to lead and lean into it. And I think that is the opportunity, is if that pressure keeps continuing, the technologies demand keeps being created and they continue to improve, that cost comes down, and that allows EPA to then look to see what are best practices that are happening. So I think in any regulatory context, not just this one, that cycle is a critical one that I see, which is why we are here today, I think, being able to get more data, get better technologies to detect it.
Yeah, strong agree with Carrie on that. And these aren't customers in the sense that you're using it, but I'll point to the efforts that are going on in the European Union and in Asian markets around really wanting to be able to certify their imports of energy and be able to really ascertain what the greenhouse gas footprint of those imports are. Those are big markets. I'm telling you that like you don't know that, but those efforts I think are also helping drive this conversation towards lower emissions, better science, better data. And then the one other thing I wanted to add too is put in a plug for OGMP 2.0, which BP is a part of. It's another effort that is trying to align companies where, it's apples to apples as far as how the data is being collected, how that data is being shared, signing up for a very low emissions footprint product and being able to verify that you're getting there. So I think that's another important effort here to mention as well.
I will say something.
Okay.
Not for you, Michael, but for the rest of the audience. Just thinking about this though, from BP's perspective and why we're entering this space and certifying our natural gas. We didn't go about certifying our entire U.S. onshore portfolio for altruism, right? I mean, there's a market for it. Our trading and shipping business is one of the largest natural gas marketers in the country. And, when they're hearing from customers a demand for natural gas with lower or verified lower methane, they're going to deliver it. So there is a shift. We are hearing from our customers interest in this space, demand for it. And so, where there is demand, we will supply. And so I think, there is a driver for this. There's a market incentive and hopefully a growing customer base for these products, which also helps sort of connect all of these methane policy and regulatory dots with having a lower carbon intensity product that our customers want and need.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to Jordan.
Yeah, very well. Well, I certainly appreciate everyone coming out today on a Friday. Let's get a quick round of applause for our panel here. I'd also like to thank our staff, Julie and Jenna sitting here to the front, as well as BP for helping co-host and making this event possible. I hope everyone has a great rest of their Friday and an excellent weekend. Again, thanks for coming out today, guys.